So I'm Roald Hoffmann, and I'm here to tell you my story from World War II, from the Holocaust, some of it from personal experience, some of it constructed from what my parents told me, at least my mother. It begins with this picture, which will become clear what this picture is with the things that I tell you. The next slide shows you a picture of three people. They're my mother and I, age 11 and a half, which is my age when I came to the United States. So I was a bit younger than you are. And we are in Queens in 1949. That's my stepfather in the picture. And we're all smiling. We're happy. And you'll see in a while also why we are happy to be here. Now, I'm going to tell you a story which is impossible to tell without a background of history, politics, and geography. And some of these things are very difficult to tell in an American setting where things didn't change, but you'll see in a moment why that is so. Europe, of course, was divided into a lot of countries. It still is. This is a map of Europe before World War II, and you'll see how some of the changes. For instance, Ukraine does not appear in this map. There was no Ukraine. It was a Soviet Socialist Republic at the time. Before World War I, there was no Poland. So these things changed with the geopolitics. The star is roughly where I was born. It was then Eastern Poland. The numbers here are the populations of Jews in these countries. And that has to do with the extent of the suffering of the Jews in World War II. In Poland, there were 3 million before the war, a substantial minority, somewhat less than African Americans in this country, but of that order of magnitude in general. We were doing pretty well in that group. We were Polish citizens, of course. After the war, there were 200,000 left. So that was the extent of over 90% of losses in World War II of Polish Jews. Losses were different for every country around. Now, a map. And now you see Ukraine. And now you see that the star is in Ukraine, where I was born. Let me tell you that when my mother was born, her birth certificate is in German and Polish. The reason was that this was part of Austria-Hungary. There was no Poland when she was born in 1911. When I was born, it was Poland. Then it was occupied by the Germans, and then it was part of the Soviet Union. And now, since 1990, it's a free and independent Ukraine. That it is in Ukraine, and I cannot tell you this story today without thinking of the Ukraine today, the subject of Russian aggression. And these are pictures from Mariupol, which is now in a Russian-occupied region. It's a seaport in southern Ukraine. And this is how it looks in 2022. And when I look at that, what comes to my mind, and what actually comes to the old brain where old memories reside, and some of our oldest memories are smells, actually. This is what Warsaw looked and smelled like when we visited there right after the Russians freed Warsaw. That smell of destruction, of gunpowder, of broken toilets, of food rotting, just of dust, is something one doesn't forget. And when I see Mariupol, I see this. So what have we learned in 70, 80 years since then? That's the problem that faces humanity in general, among other problems. But this is where I was born, a town of about 12,000 called Złoczów. The town was about 1/3 Polish population, 1/3 Ukrainian, 1/3 Jewish. That this was not a village. This was a little bourgeois town As you can see from these buildings, we lived down at the end of that street. This picture is taken just around World War I, and incidentally, this is in Polish and in German, still reflecting the Austro-Hungarian things that were there. You can see how the politics and geography are getting intertwined here. You also see this crossed out. That's I bought that postcard in Poland. That was probably a Polish patriot crossing out the German name of the town. So this is all played out in various ways. As you saw in the controversy about what was done to Iran's flag in the World Cup, it's played out all the time. People can't stop. The streets are still not paved. They're about to be paved. There are electric lines above ground. The electric lines are above ground here. Not everything is still underneath. The house I was born in, and we actually have a picture from 1937, and this is how it looked in 2006, which was my first visit back since I was born. That's my grandfather who owned the store here. We lived on the third floor there, and my grandfather is holding me in there. The balconies are the same. Even the division of the windows is the same. In a poor country, you don't tear buildings down. You just fix them up. This is 70 years later, a fixed-up building, but it's still the building we lived in. Shows my typical baby pictures that you have in your parents' photo albums. And that's my father, mother, and me, and I was their firstborn, born in July 37. My parents' name were Hill, Clara Safran. My last name today is Hoffmann. That's the third of the last names that I've had. There's a story behind that, but my first name is the same that I had from birth. There are reasons for that, for why we went through these changes. My father was a civil engineer. I showed you just before a street in this town which was still with dirt, and now he's supervising a gang with the first paving of that street, which was done not with cement but with cobblestones. Here, that's what you see them doing here. He's in the background over there. They had a machine grading this road outside of Złoczów. He was a civil engineer. He supervised the building of those roads and bridges and culverts, and that played a role later in our survival during the war. But when he went out to show his wife what he was working on, he didn't take a car because there weren't too many cars. He took a horse and buggy, which just shows you the sort of mixed technology that was at work in those times. And then the war broke out. So our war began in September 39, when the Nazis and the Soviets, who did not agree with each other, in a callous strategic move, divided up Poland. This was the map of Poland before the war. And here is the line along which they divided Poland, and now you see the star where we fell. We fell in the Soviet occupation zone of Poland for 2 years until the Nazis then invaded Russia, Poland no longer existing, in July 41. So these dates were very important to us. They were not terribly important to other people. Those 2 years under Soviet occupation were not too bad for the Polish and Jewish population in town, but they were terrible for the Ukrainians, and that in turn affected their behavior subsequently. Why was it bad for the Ukrainians? Because the Soviets had their own Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic here, and they viewed the Ukrainians in our part of Poland, outside the country, as nationalist agitators for a free and independent Ukraine. And this is much like people from one country view the people who are in exile criticizing a country. You can see that for other nationalities played out today. But they treated the Ukrainians very badly. They imprisoned 700 of the leaders of the Ukrainian community, doctors, lawyers, teachers, in a fortress above town. And in the 1 week they had after the Germans started marching to us, it took the Germans 1 week to get over here at the beginning of, in June 41. In that 1 week, the Soviet NKVD secret police killed off the Ukrainian prisoners. And that, mixing with native anti-Semitism and mistaken delusionary belief somehow that the NKVD was guided by Jews, and that led to the Ukrainian population in town welcoming the Nazis as liberators. They quickly soured on that. That was the Nazis doing, who were very stupid about their treatment of various groups that national groups that they encountered. But in the beginning, the Ukrainians collaborated with the Nazis, and that was very bad when it got mixed up with the peculiar obsessive anti-Semitism of the Nazis' ideology, because it led to troubles for the Jewish population subsequently. You'll hear a little more about this. This is just a summary of which I'm going to give throughout for what happens, because it's hard to keep clear. I was born in 1937. I'm 2 years old when we come into Soviet occupation. I'm 4 years old when the Nazis march into our part. Of course, I don't remember a thing. I do remember a few things, but very few. Just think about what you remember from age 4. And it was in that week that we had our first losses. One of them was my grandfather. I showed you a picture of my grandfather holding me in one of those. He was killed in that first week, rounded up by Ukrainian collaborators and killed by the Nazis in the first week that the Germans marched in. My uncle Abraham crawled out, was shot, was captured there, shot when my grandfather was killed, but not killed, and crawled out from among the dead to survive with a piece of a Nazi bullet in his hand to the end of his life in Brooklyn. So we had the first losses in the family at that time. We remained in that town to the end of 42 and then went into a labor camp. The labor camps were not the extermination camps. They were really structures for slave labor. To do what? To fix the roads and bridges that the Soviets had blown up as they were retreating. And to do that, my father was useful to them, to the Austrian construction company that used the slave labor, because he had built those things. So he knew about them. So that gave him a little access into the camp, which he used later in a rebellion, I'll tell you. But we were in that labor camp. So a typical labor camp was in schools like this one. People, they took over a school, they took over a Polish hospital. I mean, they took over some old military buildings. They housed in them 300, 500 Jews. They were the slaves in the slave labor. And above them was one German, one Nazi, a particularly cruel one in this case, and 30 or so armed guards who were around this, who came from every nationality that collaborated with the Germans. The guards were, some were nice people, some were sadistic. They all could be bribed. The unit of bribery was a bottle of vodka. It still is a unit of bribery in that part of the world. But if you wanted something really important, like to get out of the camp, you could do that even for a gold coin or something like that. The only things that have value in wartime. There were supposed to be no children in the camp. The guards were bribed to allow children. I was in that camp. My mother worked in the laundry. My father worked on the bridges. We had another relative in there. We remained in that labor camp all of 42. By the end of 42, rumors came in that the Nazis were shipping people to extermination camps. Of course, they didn't tell them that they were sending them to an extermination camps which were being built. They told them they're shipping them to work. They even made them buy a ticket for being shipped back to the eventually extermination camp. Some people jumped off the train. A couple of people escaped from some of the camps. They walked back to our part. They told the people what was happening. No one wanted to believe them. No one could believe that the Germans would do such a thing as simply gas people, which is what they did in closed cars, where they hooked up the exhaust back to the trucks. In the Sobibor and Belzec, in the first extermination camps there. And so no one believed them, but my father was a leader of a young Zionist socialist group, and they did believe them, and they organized an attempt to break out, which was scheduled for June 43 or for 43. This was in 42, and meanwhile, I and my mother, an uncle and aunt, were smuggled out of the camp. So again, this is not an extermination camp. There are no barbed wire walls around this. They're just a bunch of guards and people in a building. And it was possible still somehow to get out. Though next slide shows the problem. Here is where we were. And this is now in 1942 when we were in labor camp. The Germans had advanced to here in Russia, occupying a good part of Russia. The only countries that were neutral was Sweden, Switzerland, and Spain and Portugal to a certain degree. We were 1,000 kilometers from any freedom. And the only way to survive the war, there was already a sign at the end of 42 that the Germans were going to lose the war. It was the Battle of Stalingrad, somewhere over here. But you had to find someone to hide you because people didn't know where to hide. Well, some went into the forest. My uncle survived in the forest, actually. So someone to hide you. So someone had to be Polish or Ukrainian, okay? And preferably rural, because there was less police out in the country than there was in the town. Though some people instead dug bunkers, which were sort of cellars under cellars. And my only surviving grandparent, my grandmother and Uncle Abraham, the one who was shot, survived in such a bunker for 18 months in a cellar in town. We survived in 3 different ways. And in our case, my parents met a Ukrainian school teacher in a little village, a small village called Unyov, about 20 miles from the town where I was born. And he agreed to hide us. We paid him. I'll tell you later for what and how we paid him, but that wasn't why they hid us. They hid us because they were good people. In the end, they hid 5 of us. Myself, my mother, my father remained in the camp to lead the breakout attempt, and 2 uncles. One uncle in the forest came in at the end, another uncle and aunt, 5 people in all. And this family of a school teacher hid us out. Their name was Duke. I'll show you their picture in a moment. The village was called Unyv. So this is the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains. Off north of here stretches the breadbasket of Europe. Maybe you've seen this negotiations of grain shipments from Ukraine that were done in recent times. That's part of the story here. The tremendous agricultural product of wheat. Here's the small village, 50 houses in our time, 200 people, one schoolhouse, one school teacher, and a one-room schoolhouse. You'll see the schoolhouse in a moment. It's a village still today. This picture is in 2009. There are cows in the street. Then there were cows in the street now. We're walking on the one street in town, in this village, that's paved to the schoolhouse. Now I can explain to you what this is. I'm standing in back of the schoolhouse. The street of the town is running on the other side over there. This structure was not there, was built in 1950s. Terrible Soviet-era architecture. This is the schoolhouse, but it's been rebuilt. It has a new roof. The old roof was down here, but the bottom is the same. This is not standing today because the European community has built a long overdue new schoolhouse there, and but this picture was taken in 2009, I think, on my second visit there. And I'm looking at it. This is where the children would come out at recess to play, on the side away from the street. And we were hidden in that attic, which is up there. I'll show you a little bit more of that attic in a while. But here we are in the house of the family. So the school teacher, when he retired, rented first rented and then bought a house, and that house is still in the family. And this is the son, who was 7 years old, exactly my age at the end of the hiding period. So I didn't tell you about the family. The school teacher and his wife, and here they are. Okay, these are pictures are late in life. You see they're older people. They were 20 years younger or 30 years younger when they hid us out. They had 3 children, ages 7, 5, and 3. And so this family took a great risk to hide us. But I want you to think about something else. Not only did they hide us, they fed us for 1.5 years. That's how long we were in the hiding. And I want you to think about the logistics in a small village of a family of 2 adults and 3 small children, taking on the feeding of 4 adults and 1 child. That's who was in the attic. So we were not fed so well, but we were fed well enough to survive. I didn't even think about the logistics at the time. I was just a child. But later I asked Igor, that's the son of Mikola, the man who hid us out, and he said that he thought that his father, Mikola, enlisted Mikola's brother, and the brother and the father every night went to neighboring villages, a different village every night, to buy provisions for a few days, so that they tried to hide it. You had to keep this hidden from a small village. It's not easy. The other thing which you see here from a well-laden, almost Thanksgiving table, where every piece of food was made in their house except the wine, what you see is that we have maintained contact with that family. And we have, and that story I'll tell you at the end, except for 10 years, from 44 to 54, we lost contact, but otherwise we have maintained contact over 4 generations with this family who saved us. So here's a bad plan of the top of the schoolhouse. There was a classroom in front. In the back lived the teacher. That's what happened on the American frontier as well. The teacher lived in the same house they were working in, the schoolhouse, one-room schoolhouse, in between a passageway, a storage room, 1 chimney here, 1 chimney here. We got the benefit of the heat going. These chimneys were fired by wood and coal. And we got the benefit of the warmth because the chimneys, of course, came up through the attic. The attic was ended maybe about here at that time. So attics are not made to last forever. This one had to be rebuilt. In our time, it had a wooden floor over most of it, not this dirt floor that you see here. In 2006, I had a knee problem. I couldn't climb up there. That's Igor and his son-in-law, and that's me looking into the attic. The window to the front was sealed, as it is here. There was another window on the other end, and you saw that open. Here you see me looking out through that window at the other end. This window was smaller. It had wooden slats across it, which were fixed, not movable. We had an oilcloth, which we lowered over it. Incidentally, where I'm standing here, looking back at this window over here, I'm standing near the outhouses. So there were no central toilets in that school until 1995 or 8, they told me. That's where the outhouses were. This is a small village in the middle of nowhere. That's what we wanted. There was a trapdoor. You saw the trapdoor in the previous slide. The trapdoor was smaller. Every day, Duke would knock on the trapdoor, bring out 2 pails. One pail was empty. The other pail was filled with food for the next day. We handed down 2 pails. One smelled bad. That was the toilet slops for the day. The other was empty. That was the food that he had brought up the day before. That was our everyday routine. He would sometimes bring a newspaper. Newspapers were worthless. They were propaganda printed by the local press. Once in a while, a neighbor at risk to their life listened to shortwave radio and broadcast by BBC. Those things were the only news that people had. Otherwise, you got just German propaganda. So what did I do the whole day up in that attic? It was a school. At recess, the kids let out. They played in the back, just under that window, through which I could look in a limited field of view. What I mean by that is I couldn't see everything. If one of the boys kicked the ball and the ball went off to the side, I couldn't follow that. I couldn't stick my head out or I would be seen. So I could just see part of the action. I remember that being very frustrating. It was time for me to learn how to read. I was 6, 7. My mother taught me to read in Polish, and she taught me how to write. The attic was actually full of books. Those were the class books for the school. They just were where they were stored away. And among them, what I remember especially are geography books. I loved them. They were very simple maps in these of the world, of different countries. Blue for the sea, green for the land, but the deserts were in orange or in yellow. And my mother would teach me latitude and longitude actually at age 6 and 7. I learned it. She taught me how to locate places. She would ask me questions. She would construct essentially geography puzzles for me. How to get from Poland to San Francisco or to Timbuktu. And I'd have to tell her what seas I would have to go through. And if I got those complicated sounding seas around Denmark wrong, she would chide me gently and ask me to do it again. We played games. She came up with endless games, paper games of one kind or another. The only toy that we had actually was a deck of cards, if you can call that a toy. But I used it. Not only did we play cards, but I got very good at building houses out of cards. I was surrounded by a lot of love in a very dangerous place. And the reason I took this picture was I wanted to show you that attics are for ventilation. That's how they work, by providing insulation through them. And so they're open to the elements. These slats didn't have any cover. We put an oilcloth over it. didn't provide much. We slept in our clothing on straw mattresses. Climate in Ukraine, it's about that you have here in the worst times. So not like now. There's a week at minus 25 Fahrenheit, and there are 2 months which temperature on average is below freezing. We survived the first winter in these conditions. The second winter was too hard, and we moved down to the first floor for the coldest weeks of the winter, which was to those storerooms. Father remained in the camp to lead the attempt to break out. He smuggled weapons from my uncle in the forest. We had a pretty activist family. He smuggled hand grenades and taken apart pistols, that's all they had, into the camp from my uncle in the forest. Where did my uncle get them? He got them from stores that the Russians had left behind, or they had stolen the weapons from the local villagers. They smuggled the weapons, they had the weapons, but a couple of days before the breakout, the attempt was betrayed by a fellow participant, a Jew, and the organizers were arrested, interrogated, tortured, and killed on June 30th, 1943. I and my mother were at that time in hiding. Someone brought the news to the Duke's family. My mother cried. She tried not to cry. Eventually, a letter came, actually, from a friend who had witnessed the execution. And so we knew it was true. I refused to believe it, which is typical what children. I was 6 years old at the time. But eventually, I believed it, of course. We had still another year in hiding at that point. To one of those storerooms, we dug out a space below the storeroom, and we lifted up a floor plank, dug out the earth. Duke was in on this. He brought out the pails of earth as he went at night, and when there was a really bad time, for instance, there were occasionally police that came for no bad reason. A policeman came to the schoolhouse, but for us that was dangerous. At the end of the war, for a week, German soldiers were quartered in there as they were retreating. That was very dangerous for us. In those days, we went into the storage room. We lifted up the floor planks, went into the space we had dug out, and sat on a bench. The space was about 5 feet by 2 feet, enough for a bench. We sat in it, and Duke would move the boards across, would move a cupboard on top of the boards, and you couldn't see what was there. I remember the smell of the place. There was nothing in particular bad about that. It was the smell that you get when you dig for earthworms in the soil. But imagine, the setting was very different. How did I get through this? How did we all get through this? Well, I can just say for myself, there was this terrible danger outside. But right around me, with my family there, I was surrounded by incredible love. And I think psychologically, this is what saved me. That room now, storeroom, the 2 storerooms, had been rebuilt by 2006 into a classroom. This was the classroom. This cupboard looks still like what it might have looked like during the war, of what was moved across the planks. Under those planks, we had a second hiding place that I mentioned to you. That classroom is now a chemistry classroom. You see Mendeleev's periodic table, you see something in Ukrainian. Mendeleev's table looks the same in any language. So I'm a chemist. I was hidden under the boards of that 65 years before that. But the kids in that classroom didn't know about my story. Now they know, but at that time they didn't. Amazing what fate brings you. War was ending. All pictures from wartime look easy. All military history textbooks look easy. They don't portray the people being killed in the process. The Soviets bore the brunt of the war. When we were freed over here, in June 44, the war was far from over. June 44, American soldiers were dying on the beaches of Normandy, way over here, as the Americans and British and Canadians, Australians participated in the coming back to the mainland. They had come to Italy, which is over here. Next slide shows my first picture after the war. I'm 7 years old, Polish identity document. Now we begin to have photographs again. In Krakow, about 8 months after liberation, my mother and I, here I'm wearing some leather pants and my school uniform. And boys had to wear long black stockings, part of the school uniform. Here's my mother. The first thing my mother did after the war was to buy the coat that you see there and the hat. That was not a luxury. That was a part of becoming human again. You could go out and buy something. Doesn't matter what. And I'm wearing something too. My mother remarried a man who had lost his wife in the war. A lot of that happened in that period. And there is much more that happens. We remained in Poland a year. We then became refugees in Czechoslovakia, Austria, and Germany. And until we came to the United States, it still took 5 years from the end of the war till we got to the United States. So I share a fate with many of the immigrants trying to get into the United States from many different places around the world. We knew the American immigration laws, just the ways that people in Uganda and Honduras know the American immigration laws, and they know them much better than Americans do, because their fate depended on the changes in these government laws. So now, why are we happy? We're in America. We lived happily ever after. But there is one more thing I want to tell you. I want to tell you what our losses were. We were the largest family group that survived, 7 people in 3 different ways. In hiding, in a bunker under a basement in the forest. But still our losses were 3 or 4 grandparents were killed by the Nazis. My father, 3 aunts, all of my first cousins. In general, what you see here is typical in the sense that older people and children did not survive. Who survived are people in full health who could go through the various deprivations that the war caused. And this is the story of our survival. You notice also I didn't show you a single picture of a person being killed, because that's not the purpose of this. Nor is it to say that I give you the numbers, 200 or 4,000 survived. I'm not interested in showing pictures of death. You can see those in other places. There is just one more piece of the story I want to tell you. What I wanted to tell you a little bit is about the tie with the family, because I wanted to end a little bit on a little bit more of an up point. So these are the 2 people who saved us. We are grateful. We keep in touch with them. We send a gift in memory of their parents this day. In the beginning, we had to send it through the Soviet consulate, but after a while, we could send them things. When we were there, we said a prayer at the grave. I read Psalm 23 at the grave of Maria and Mikola Duke in that village. We've kept in touch. Here's my son Hillel, who's a journalist, and he's talking with Igor Duke. This is the man who is my equivalent, the son of the family who hid us. Same age exactly. He just died in January. They're talking men talk. They don't share a language. That's okay. They can talk about tying fishing flies in any language, without any language. And that's what they're doing. Here is my daughter Ingrid, who works for the Paleontological Research Institution in Ithaca. Some of you have been in the Museum of the Earth or the Nature Center they have. They're talking about Ukrainian embroidery with the rest of the Duke family. And at some point in that discussion, the daughter-in-law who is here of the man who hid us takes out something. And the moment she takes this out, I knew what it was. And let me tell you what it was, because it's a symbol, much more than what it is. It's a runner. It's a runner that's embroidered at both ends. It's made of handmade linen. It's embroidered in a typical Ukrainian pattern of characteristic. Anyone across the world will recognize this as Ukrainian because the colors are red, green, and black. They're very, very interesting color scheme. And what it's used is to wrap around an icon in a house as a decoration. And she took this out, but I know what this was about. One day we get a letter from the family of her mother-in-law. So that's Maria Duke, the woman in the family who gave us the food while we were in hiding. And she says, could you send us some colored embroidery thread? My mother, she writes this to my mother, who's in Jackson Heights in Queens. And my mother says, don't they have embroidery thread? She said, what do they need it from us? But she goes and talks to a Russian woman who is living in the next house, and the Russian woman tells her that yes, they have embroidery thread in the Ukraine, but it runs. It's poor quality. When you wash it, the red runs onto the fabric that you've embroidered it on. That's not good. And so my mother in Jackson Heights goes down to the local Sewing Notion store, which is like the store that her father ran in this town, Złoczów, where we were born. And she buys the best quality French-made, DMC is the brand, embroidery thread in these colors in Queens, puts it in a package, sends it to the Soviet Union, to Ukraine, where Maria Duke in this little village embroiders handmade Ukrainian linen with that French embroidery thread that was bought in Jackson Heights and that we got. This is material objects, but these material objects often carry a spiritual weight. That ruzhik, as it's called in Ukrainian, that cloth is much more than that cloth. It's a symbol of an eternal tie between that family and our family, which goes back to a period when good people did what they should do in a time that was terrible and that many people did not do. We are the beneficiaries of that. Too few. Thank you.